If you have a Bible with you, open up to the book of Luke. We've been in it for a year now, exactly. And we will finish at the end of April. We're in Luke chapter 18. We got in a little late last night. We were in the city at a show and had dinner and didn't get to bed till midnight. So I was a little fuzzy this morning and came in and I walked in and I put my notes down on the stand here and they were slipping off. And I kept looking at it and I was kind of shaking my head. Green tea had kicked in and I looked at it. There was no lip on the stand. It was weird. It was gone. And the top of the stand was all scraped up. I thought, what has been going on in this place? And I looked and I stared. I grabbed the nail. We went back. We searched the back. We clearly got the wrong stand. Came back out. And you know, by the way, I figured it out. You didn't figure this out.
You have
Let me just point that out this morning. It was upside down. And I immediately thought it was Grossi. I thought, Grossi has stolen the stand lip. How do you steal a stand lip? Only Jerry could do this. But you didn't, so thank you very much. But Jerry would. On the day he reads Advent, he would steal the stand lip. Chapter 18 and verse 9. And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves, that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. 2 men, Jesus said, went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood and was praying this to himself, God, I thank you that I am not like other people, swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector over here. I fast twice a week, I pay tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. I tell you, this man went to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. As I've read this parable over the years, I've always had 2 reactions, and your reactions might be very similar. My 2 reactions when I read this little teeny parable at the end of Jesus' life is, first of all, it's obviously probably a parable about prayer. That seems to be what it's about. The message must be about prayer. And my second reaction, which is way stronger than the first, is, and it's a gut reaction, what a jerk. Anybody here, when you read this or heard this, have this reaction at all? You're all liars this morning. When you read this, you just have this reaction like, what a jerk. This guy's standing on the Temple Mount, and he just thinks he's better than everybody else. Another way of saying that would be, I'm so glad I'm not like this Pharisee. And as you say that, the statement gives us all away. You see, this is the reaction Jesus is looking for as he tells this parable. As he tells the parable about this jerky Pharisee, your reaction is, what a jerk. And Jesus says, you prove my point. You prove my point. Obviously, there's some thought in here about prayer and some things you can learn from prayer, but I truly believe that is not really what this parable is about. And in a rare instance, Luke actually tells us, because he knows we're knuckleheads, and he knows we need insight, let me tell you what the parable is actually about before I tell you the parable that Jesus spoke. Look at verse 9 again. And this is Luke speaking. And he, Jesus, also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. For months now, we've been looking at a theme with Jesus and this group of people called the Pharisees, this very religious, upright group that wanted to protect Israel from itself and make sure that they followed the Torah to its nth degree to make sure God would accept them. And for months we've looked at a theme that keeps recurring of what these Pharisees are like. And we basically boiled it all down to an answer. So what I want to do is play a form of pastoral Russian roulette and ask you, what is the main issue with the Pharisee? And on rare occasion, I'm looking for one answer. So no pressure on you whatsoever. Does anybody remember what we boiled the Pharisees' issue down to? Crickets.
Blindness.
Blindness to what? I love that you didn't say they focus on what they do. That's a result, right?
Self-righteous.
They were self-righteous, but they were blind, and so what were they not looking at? Themselves. We built this slide, and we put this together, we've looked at this for weeks and weeks and weeks. The real issue that Jesus speaks into is that they're dishonest about their own heart. They fight their own reality. They're broken, they're weak, they're inconsistent, they're you and I. And yet they fight that. And so rather than looking at their own heart before God, there's only one choice left in the equation. If I don't look inwardly at my heart before God, I look at my outside compared to everybody else. There's only one or the other. This is gravity. This is the DNA that has been wired into our universe. You either look inwardly at yourself and stay connected with how weak you are before God, or you fight that reality, you want to keep your head above water, so you decide, I will make sure I compare myself to the losers around me to feel better about myself. Does that make sense? This is the issue with the Pharisees. They refuse to be honest with their own heart. And thus, they turn to morality and judging with contempt the people around them to feel better about themselves, to keep their head above the waterline. This is an extremely ugly equation. This is an equation that the Pharisees lived in, and unfortunately, this is an equation that you and I know very, very well. All day long, we are doing one of two things. We are either connected with our own brokenness, or we are connected with the brokenness of everybody else around us. We only have two choices, and we always pick one of them. Those that focus on morality and being perfect and want to live out this life of their own stability and nature will crumble under the sheer weight of needing to perform and having a false sense of themselves. It'll ultimately do us in, as it did the Pharisees. Our parable this morning, again, is an amazing poem in kind of an A-B fashion. It's a 6-scene poem, this parable is. And in the center of this parable, which is always the heart of what Jesus is trying to say, he's really pounding a question to us. What does it mean to be considered a righteous person? Now, in the Greek Hellenistic world, it was very clear what a righteous person was. A righteous person in the Greek kind of Hellenistic world of Jesus' time was a person who obeyed or followed a certain code of ethics, and they were cultured. They were a cultured person that lived well, and they lived by a certain code of ethics. It was a very do-oriented thing in the Greek Hellenistic world. This is not the definition of the New Testament, and the New Testament definition comes out of the Old Testament. The Old Testament definition or ideology of what a righteous person is 100% different than what this Greek Hellenistic mindset is. Of what I do makes me righteous. It is exactly the opposite. Rather than, in the Old Testament thought, following a code of ethics to make you righteous, what makes you righteous is somebody else outside of you granting that permission to you. In other words, in this case, it's God looking at us saying, I accept you. I will grant you the view of being righteous. I will grant you the state of being righteous. It never is generated internally. It's always handed from one to another. We see this probably more clearly than anything in the life of Jacob. The three main patriarchs in the Old Testament were Abraham, his son Isaac, and then his son Jacob. I remember teaching in this in Journey. It was probably a dozen years ago upstairs. And I was teaching the life of Jacob. And we got about 2 months into the study, and finally this dear friend of ours, they moved to Colorado, Jen Wren. Just God love this woman if you know her. She's just fantastic. She finally just threw her hands up. She goes, stop. I said, what? There's 50, 60 people in the room. She goes, I can't take this anymore. This guy is such a jerk, this Jacob guy. I can't stand this guy. What does God see in this guy? I mean, he's a horrible husband. He's awful. He's an even worse father. He has next to no faith. I mean, his pagan brother is 10 times the man as he is. And yet God basically dubs him a prince. A prince in the faith line of Christianity. This is what is at the heart of the Old Testament Hebrew thought behind what righteousness is. God liked him. There. That's it. I don't know why, quite frankly. You read the story, what you end up doing when you study Jacob, the majority of your time is finding out one thing that's likable about this guy. God named his nation after this knucklehead. He changed his name to Israel and then named his people after this screw-up. God gave him, he granted to him the saving act of righteousness. That's the idea behind this. I love the verses in Micah. Can you throw those up for me, Rebecca? My people, what have I done to you? God says. And how have I wearied you? Answer me. Indeed, I brought you up from the land of Egypt, meaning he did it, and ransomed you from the house of slavery, and I sent before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. My people, remember me, so that you might know the righteous acts. That's the same word, this righteous word, this saving acts, this granting from one to another. God is granting this righteousness to his people of the Lord. And Micah writes this, and he asks himself, gee, what do you do? What could I possibly do for God? Throw up these next few verses. And this is what he comes to. What shall I come to the Lord and bow myself before God on high? With what shall I bring? Shall I come to him with burnt offerings, with yearling calves? Does the Lord take delight in thousands of rams, in 10,000 rivers of oil? Shall I present my firstborn for my rebellious acts, the fruit of my body for the sin of my soul? Do you see what he's saying? God, I see what you did for me. See, he's not comparing himself to the people around him like the Pharisees did. Micah's saying, I stand before God, and it is really tilted on who has done what for whom. And he doesn't know what to do to say thank you. He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly before your God. This is what Micah comes up with. To feel deeply your humility before God and simply want to thank him for it. Not to pay him back. These are the two questions we keep summing up our entire Christian faith to. Remember this? What are those two questions? God, do you really love me? And if you do, is there a way I can say thank you to you today? That's it. That's all you've got in your whole life. Every day when you wake up, there's your two issues every day. God, have you loved me? Have you cared for me? And is there some way I can just say thank you? Not to make you like me, not to somehow repay you, but just because I can't help myself. This is not the equation of the Pharisees. This is not the equation of one who hides from his own reality and judges those around them to feel better about themselves and their own life. Feeling somehow we have pulled our weight will invariably lead us to look at other people with contempt. The real focus of this parable is not prayer. The real focus of this parable is having an honest view of our own soul before God and simply dropping our head and saying, God, thank you. Verse 9. And he also told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and viewed others with contempt. And he said, 2 men went up into the temple to pray, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. Now, when we hear this word pray, it's very different. When I think of the word prayer, I think of, okay, I'm going to pray to God. And then when I hear the word worship, I think of a bunch of people like this getting in a room and then we worship God. Right? We think of them separately. In Semitic language, they don't think this way. So if a Middle Eastern person said, I'm going to go to the church to pray, the Middle Eastern person would automatically assume you're going to a worship service. Now, you may be praying within the worship service, but the assumption is prayer and worship go together. They're not different. And so that's the setting we have in this. They're going to the temple, to a public place of prayer. Jesus called the temple his Father's house of prayer. Because it's not just a place where individuals go and pray. It's a place where you go and worship God and pray. And so when you hear this parable, two men went up into the temple to pray, you know they're going up to a public worship service on the Temple Mount. So the next question you should ask is, well, what service are they going to? Well, there was only one service that took place every day in the temple, and it took place twice a day. It took place at dawn and at 3 p.m. It was the daily offer of atonement. Now, if you've been in Christianity a long time, or you're Jewish and know your heritage, you think of the atonement service as the annual Day of Atonement, the big, big Day of Atonement when the high priest sacrificed the one particular lamb and went into the Holy of Holies. That's not what this is. They actually did that every single day, twice a day. And the whole service is laid out for them. And so these two individuals, this tax collector and this Pharisee, are on the Temple Mount, probably in the afternoon, could be in the morning, and they are there for the daily atonement service. It's a worship service. And the process was this. They had an officiating priest. They would be drawn by lottery. Of all the priests, they would draw one priest. That priest, he would be an officiating priest. He would kill a lamb on behalf of the people. He would throw all this blood all over the altar. Throw up the picture. And so this is a model in Jerusalem they built of the Temple Mount. And so the big flat area around those walls, that's the Temple Mount area. Then you would go inside that first little door. There was an altar there. They would sacrifice, the high priest would. They would pour the blood all over the altar. And then go through that second little opening. And you see that tall little box in the back? That's called the sanctuary. And there's two sections in the sanctuary, if you're going to really, really generalize it. There's the first half that you go in, and there's showbread in there, and the lampstand, and the incense. And then there was a big, big curtain, and then behind the curtain was the Ark of the Covenant, and that's when they went in only once a year. The high priest would go in there. So forget about the back half of the sanctuary. That little box, the big kind of standing box there, that's the sanctuary. So what would happen was the high priest would come, the one selected by lottery, the officiating priest, sacrifice a lamb for the people twice a day. They were all outside worshiping, and splashes blood all over the altar. Then they would have some prayers. They would sound these trumpets. They would clang these cymbals. They would read a psalm. And then the officiating priest would go into the first room of that sanctuary, and he would light some incense, offer it to God. He would trim the lamps. He would make sure that God accepted the sacrifice for the sins of the people for that moment. And then the officiating priest would come out. While the officiating priest was in that sanctuary, doing the incense and doing these things, the people, that was their chance to pray as individuals. And it's interesting, in the Torah, Moses lays this whole service out, but he never mentions during the worship service people praying individually. They actually didn't start this until the synagogues were built, and they started coming back from the exile in Babylon around 500 or so BC. So this practice of praying individually had only taken place for about 500 years outside the temple. And we've seen this before, and it's all spelled out in the Mishnah. We saw this in chapter 1. Does anybody remember where we saw this exact scene? Zechariah. Zechariah was John the Baptist's dad, right? And he got picked by lottery to be this officiating priest. And so in chapter 1, verse 10, it says, and the whole multitude of the people were in prayer, so they're all outside praying individually, after they sacrificed this lamb in the hour of the incense offering. So that's when the high priest would go into the sanctuary. So this is the service that we're talking about in this parable. How's that for just a little bit too much background? Verse 11. The Pharisee stood up and was praying this to himself. God, I thank you that I am not like the other swindlers, unjust, adulterers, or even like this loser tax collector. I fast twice a week. I pay tithes of all I get. The first thing to point out is it's the way it's written. It says, and the Pharisee stood up and was praying this to himself. Literally what it means is he was standing by himself. He's praying, but he's praying away from the other people. Now let me ask you a quick question. Knowing what you just read, why would this Pharisee, you think, and there's probably multiple reasons, why would he be standing by himself? What's that? Because he wasn't like them. He wasn't like who? All those other people. It's really, the term would be those defiled people. You see, he has undefiled people on the temple now. If he so much as brushes against their clothing, he becomes undefiled. And he doesn't consider himself defiled. So he will stand far off and pray to God. It's fascinating to me that the irony of this just drips. I mean, realize what's taking place. This guy is standing there for the daily sacrifice of his personal sins. He has just watched a lamb get slaughtered and blood just splashed over this altar for him. A graphic scene about what it takes to correct his sinful behavior for that day. And while that's taking place, while his sins are being atoned for with a sheep, God's accepting a stupid sheep for the payment for his sin. God thinks this is enough. While that's taking place, he's standing way away from everybody else, disconnected from his own internal defilement. See? And comparing himself to everybody else. It's just unbelievable. Again, the equation the Pharisees have is deafening. Refusing to look at their own heart to see what they're really like. Capable, self-capable, if you will, able on their own to honor God in their mind with the way they live. And as a result, he disdains the people around him. And more than likely, by the way, it says he's standing by himself to pray. And as was and still is the Jewish custom, he's probably praying out loud. When you go to the Western Wall today, it's not quiet. It's very loud. They pray out loud. And this is not always the case, by the way, so please don't hear this wrong. But a guy like this is pretty clear. He's probably killing two birds with one stone. He's praying, and it's an opportunity to teach the unrighteous, defile people around him all at the same time. I'm sure you've never heard anybody pray and give a sermon all at once. This has never happened, right? And it's fascinating to me, the Pharisee has substituted now what God has done for him for what he has done for God. Isn't that fascinating? His view now is not one of God, look what you've done for me. It's God, look what I've done for you. And oh, by the way, these other people haven't. Oh, by the way, they don't measure up to me in the slightest. Just as another side note, the Pharisees saw the Torah, the law, as a garden of flowers. That's how the rabbis described the Torah. It's a garden of flowers that you have to keep and respect. You never want to trample on those flowers. So they would do what they called building a fence around the flowers. They would build a fence around the Torah so as never to encroach upon breaking the law of the Torah. And they developed all these oral and written laws. They're both there for interpretation of the Torah, but also as a fence, if you will, so that you never encroach even closely upon the Torah and trampling on the Torah. And this guy actually gives two examples of what his fences look like. When he says in verse 12, I fast twice a week and I pay tithes of all that I get. This fasting deal, the Torah only required you to fast on the annual Day of Atonement. And later the Pharisees thought, we should probably do more. We should probably make sure we put a fence around that law. And so they decided we will fast 2 days before and 2 days after each festival, not just the annual Day of Atonement. So 12 days of fasting. There's your fence around the garden. This Pharisee is so impressive, he builds a fence around the garden, and he says, I do it twice a week. This guy's really impressive. He also says that he tithes of all that he gets. In the Old Testament, the people would tithe on grain, oil, and wine. And then later on, as the rabbis studied this, and they developed this, they said, okay, we don't want to trample on the Torah. They decided, let's make sure we tithe on anything that comes out of the ground that would watch over any of those things. And then they developed pages and pages, and you can read them today in the mission, of exceptions to that rule. What this guy says is, I won't even follow the exceptions in the Mishnah. I don't want any part of those. I want a fence around the fence around the Torah. Extremely impressive, right? Verse 13. But the tax collector, standing some distance away, there's a familiar image, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, the sinner. Seeing his defiled ceremonial state, in touch with his own inconsistent, lousy reality, this tax collector, he also stands apart. But he doesn't stand apart because he doesn't want to get defiled. He stands apart because he knows he's defiled. And the standard posture for prayer was to stand with your feet together. If you go again to the Western Wall, you'll see this today. With your head down and your arms crossed over your chest and bowed to the ground. Even the priests, when they say the blessing of the people, lower their eyes to the ground. But oh, not this guy. This guy, it says, is beating his chest as he prays. In the Middle East, almost routinely, the only time you will see someone beating their chest, it's a woman. And it's almost only at a funeral when somebody dies. The only other time we see in the text where people are beating their chest is, take a guess. What? But do you know the specific story? It's at the cross. Well, there's a mixture of men and women, by the way. It's the only other time we read the text that people are beating their chest other than women at a funeral. Do you get the connection in this? This guy is so distraught that the only example the Bible can come up with to let you know how this tax collector feels is Jesus being mutilated on the cross. This is the example of what internally this tax collector is feeling before God. And by the way, the text doesn't use the standard word for mercy. You know, where he says, God, be merciful to me. This is not just be merciful to me. It literally means make atonement for me. This means forgive me, I'm such a louse. I can't get my life right. Now, remember the scene we're looking at. Both men are standing there afar off. Here stands the tax collector. He watches the blood being splashed over this altar for this graphic scene to represent what it will take to remove his sins for that day. The officiating priest disappears into the sanctuary to offer incense before God on his behalf. Cymbals clanging, psalm being read, trumpets blowing. He prays, and as the priest comes out to let the people know God has accepted the sacrifice for your sins for today, his only response is to beat his own heart and say, that sheep will never do it. It's a stupid sheep. The sheep is not what I gave my forgiveness and atonement for. God, I need you to do it. Isn't that just an amazingly graphic scene? Jesus then responds in verse 14, I tell you, this guy went to his house justified. This word justified is the same word, our righteous word. It's the saving act of God granted to an individual. Why? Because he likes you. This man went to his house accepted by God and deemed righteous rather than the other guy. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. One man goes to the temple feeling his oats, on what he's done for God. The other, a defiled tax collector, who feels that this lamb is not what is going to save him. It is the God behind this sheep. Stands in humility before God and says, I have nothing to offer you. He throws himself at the mercy of the Father and says, unless you grant me righteousness, I'll never gain it on my own. And Jesus says, that was all I was looking for. One guy who dared to be honest with his insides for but a moment. And God grants him the saving act of righteousness for eternity. John 1:29 says this, behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. See, this is not some dumb sheep. This is the Messiah. This is the Savior. This is the Master who comes and says, I will make atonement for you. And oh, by the way, you won't have to look beyond me for that forgiveness. I meant it. Acknowledge me and acknowledge your own fragile state, but for a moment before me, and I'll never get over it, he says. Did I put Isaiah 66 up there? Yeah. Thus says the Lord, heaven is my throne and the earth is my footstool. Where then is a house you can build for me? And where is a place that I may rest? For my hand made all these things. Thus all these things came into being, declares the Lord. But this one I will look to. To him who is humble and contrite of spirit and trembles at my word. God asks nothing of you and I other than one thing. Honesty. Honesty before him. God, I'm weak. God, I'm broken. God, I can't do it on my own. God, I try to do it on my own all the time. God, I view other people with contempt all the time rather than just being honest with what I'm really like. This is all he asks of us. And you can save me. Not a sheep, but the Lamb of God can save me. Don't make Christianity more than it is. It's already confusing enough. Life is already confusing enough. Let the gospel, the true gospel, reign with you and I. A simplicity where we simply beat our chest before God in humility. Not in shame, not in guilt, not in worthlessness, but in absolute freedom that the Father accepts you and I because of the blood of Christ. Amen? Amen. Let's pray. Father, this should make us smile. This should make us walk out of here with levity today. Every one of us has attempted life on our own, or we wouldn't be in this room right now. And every one of us knows it hasn't worked, or we wouldn't be in this room right now. Father, we honestly tell you, we cannot make it without you. And we're really comfortable with that. Thank you that you're more comfortable with that than we are. We fall upon you and ask for your mercy. We thank you that if we've done that for even but a moment, we have the atoning blood of Christ for a lifetime. May we allow that to wash over us to the point where we simply say,